Adam, do you think the banks are on strong ground for not passing on this rate cut?
No, look, I don't. I mean, the fact is, over the past 3 rate cuts, of course, the RBA has cut by 75 basis points. The 4 majors have cut by 57 basis points. And indeed, for small business loans, they've only cut by 23 basis points. Actually, no one ever really talks about the small business loans, but they are very important. But just on your central question, look, the banks will say that, you know, they can't cut as much because of the need to attract deposits and because official rates are getting closer to zero. But the reality is official rates are still a fair way from zero. And so this idea that their deposit side is actually binding, if you like, with zero, because, of course, they can't cut their deposit rates below zero. And quite naturally, the banks want to preserve their overall margins. But I just think that they can't make that argument quite yet because we aren't close enough to zero.
Andrew, there's talk that there'll be another 1, maybe another 2 further cuts from the RBA. What happens when we get right down very close to, if not zero?
Well, then you start to get talk of doing the sorts of things that the US Fed did, that the ECB is doing, the Bank of Japan, where you get into the business of the Reserve Bank starting to buy assets as a way of so-called quantitative easing, as a way of further driving down long-term interest rates, because technically the Reserve Bank, when we talk about the cash rate, that's the overnight cash rate. The bank wants to try to influence long-term borrowing rates as well, and it can take a series of measures to do that. But again, it's extraordinary that we are talking about those sorts of things now. There isn't the faintest evidence that we are in this sort of emergency situation in the economy at this stage that would warrant that sort of activity. And if I can just go back for a moment, I think Adam made an extremely important point there in that last discussion where he made the point, again, if the Reserve Bank in talking about these rate cuts is focused on trying to increase economic activity, not just affecting asset prices, in particular house prices, then it's critical that you'd be trying in particular to boost business investment, get businesses going out and spending and new businesses being set up. And if, in fact, as Adam was saying, only a third of the cut in the cash rate has been passed through to small businesses, it again raises a very big question mark over whether this is really the right way to be going about trying to boost growth.
OK, well, let me pick up on that point, Adam. You're right about small businesses not really getting the kicker out of this. If that's where they want to drive investment and spending, this is not the right way to go around it, sure. But also another stated aim of the RBA governor is to improve employment numbers. Now, of course, this is all occurring at the same time as the government is still wedded to an increase in superannuation. So if you're a small business, you haven't got much cut in the money that you owe the bank. At the same time, you're told to employ more people, but you know coming down the pipeline, you're going to have to pay your current employees more in terms of super, and there's very little wage growth. How do you make it all add up?
Yeah, look, certainly that's a good point. One of the frustrating things I think about the Reserve Bank's remarks recently is they do talk a lot about weak wage growth and how that's a terrible thing, but they haven't come out and said that a wise thing to do would be not to go ahead with the increase in the superannuation guarantee, because of course that will, in the short term, the short to medium term, of course, it will come out of businesses' pockets, but in the long run it will certainly come out of workers' pockets, and indeed it will just fuel this stagnant period of household consumption growth that the Reserve Bank has been complaining about.
Andrew, we're going to run out of time very shortly, but I was very interested in comments from Mark Latham. He fears that Gladys Berejiklian will renege on her commitments to cut in half the migration rate into New South Wales, in particular Sydney. Do you think she will?
Well, in a sense, it was a fake commitment to begin with, because ultimately it's the federal government that controls the immigration into Australia, and then people can broadly go where they want. Now, that the federal government is actually trying to do some things to get people to go more into regional areas and so forth. But in that sense, this is all very much window dressing, I think.
Well, she fooled the people in the March election.
Well, this thing there. What the New South Wales government and other state governments could do is be much more vocal about this issue with the federal government and call not just for discussions at COAG meetings, but call for a further cut in the actual permanent migration intake, and also in particular a cut in the number of temporary visas, especially, for example, student visas. So we now have this crazy situation where many of our major universities have more than 40% of their students are foreign students. Those are what are adding a huge amount to the total overseas migration into Australia and creating a lot of these pressures.